All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm the CEO and co-founder of SlashID. SlashID is an identity security platform focused on ISPM and ITDR. Just a couple of words of my background because they'll inform kind of like the rest of the presentation. Before SlashID, I was at CrowdStrike and worked on their mobile and identity protection product. And in a past life, I used to be a security researcher. I'm on the board of Black Hat. Originally used to focus a lot on browser exploitation and that kind of offensive work. So a lot of what you're going to see in this presentation is partially influenced by my background on sort of like the threat side of things. So let's start with some statistics. The CrowdStrike Global Threat Report was just released about an hour ago for 2025. And one of the trends that CrowdStrike has observed over the years is that the number of malware-free breaches that they track across their customer environments is basically skyrocketed. From in 2019, it was about 40%. Today is almost 80%. And what that means is, more often than not, identity plays a role in an attacker kill chain. And I'm going to talk in a second about where in the kill chain and what it means. But we're seeing like a very clear trend, not just from CrowdStrike, but from the rest of the market. And so the kind of like meme that attackers don't break in, they log in, seems to ring true by the day. So let me get you some more data from the various kind of like reports that are out there. So as you probably know, Verizon does a yearly report on all the breaches that they track. Over the years, they tracked about like 35,000 breaches or so, and they believe that 31% of all the breaches they've ever tracked are caused by stolen credentials. CrowdStrike has seen a 583% year-on-year increase in kerberoasting attacks through their managed security services. And then the last one, which I think is probably one of the most interesting ones, is that the AWS CERT sees about 66% of breaches happening to AWS customers happening because of leaked credentials, more than basically any other kind of initial. So let's talk a bit about kind of like what a kill chain looks like today. So it used to be the case, at least like when I started in the industry, that most of the kill chain used to be malware or some form of an exploit, either server side or client side, and then you would move from there to move laterally, often again with another exploit. What actually is happening today is very different. So what happens today is you generally, as we've seen from like Verizon data and so on, you generally start a breach either through some form of phishing, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second, or some kind of credential leak. The most obvious ones would be like AWS long-term access key that is left somewhere in a code repo, but we've seen many variations of credential leaks in terms of like sophistication and how they're actually leaked. So at that point, you have some form of initial footprint in the customer, in the attack, in the sort of like victim environment. And now what you have to do as an attacker is to move laterally and escalate privileges. And again, in the past, it used to be that you would use like a local privilege escalation exploit kind of thing to move laterally and maybe get access to the domain controller and whatnot. But what we're seeing increasingly is that actually what happens today is attackers have various ways to harvest credentials, and they then use these credentials to both move laterally as well as escalate privileges. And we're going to talk in a second about like why that's the case and how that happened, but it's become a significant trend. So I mentioned earlier that I was at CrowdStrike for 4 years. The reason why the reason why we acquired the identity protection product was that we were seeing most lateral movement breaches happening through some form of AD-related issue. And then lastly, you generally have some form of data exfiltration. And here is where like the attackers behave slightly differently between like nation states and e-crime groups. For nation states, you see a number of different like persistence mechanisms that they use. Sometimes they are like old school kind of like rootkits, but more often than not, we're starting to see more and more identity-based persistence techniques. So let me zoom in terms of like how people are actually getting compromised today. So I mentioned phishing, and phishing clearly is not new. And as we all know, it used to be that phishing was just about like stealing a username and password from somebody. And then MFA came into play and it became all about like MFA bombing. And what we're seeing today is that phishing is evolving quite a bit. So one, we're seeing phishing using auth2 flows that are a bit more esoteric. Just recently, there was a breach where somebody was using a auth2 device flow against Microsoft, where by default, Microsoft would ask you to insert a code to log in. The other very famous one is what happened with Midnight Blizzard. So this was one of the publicized Microsoft breaches. And in that case, what happened was that the attacker used an auth2 app that looks very legitimate to basically phish the victim, and then the victim granted the attacker permissions to access mailboxes and a bunch of other things. So we're seeing that phishing is definitely not dead, and is actually just evolving towards sort of like harder and harder to detect flows. The second thing, again, as we mentioned, leaked credentials. So some of the obvious things are leaked API keys in source codes. We know that like GitHub and other providers now even have like built-in mechanisms to detect them. Sometimes they have collaborations with vendors to potentially automatically rotate or decommission credentials. But API keys are just sort of like the beginning of the universe of leaked credentials and access tokens. So I'm going to mention one which I think is one of the more interesting ones. So, and not to sort of like go against Microsoft too much, but like Microsoft has been breached twice in the past 2.5 years because of an identity-related attack. The second one was Midnight Blizzard, as we just discussed, so auth2 flow. But the first one was even more interesting because the first one was perpetrated by a threat actor called Storm0558, which is presumed to be affiliated with the Chinese PLA. And what they did there was they had a very clever sort of like set of techniques. Namely, they found a key material for a signing key in a crash dump that was accidentally exposed by a Microsoft engineer in 2021. And then they used that key material to forge valid tokens for Entra. And I'm going to talk about the detection in a second, but basically that's how they've compromised Microsoft, presumably for a couple of years. And Microsoft didn't realize that they had been breached until the State Department, the SOC of the State Department, found weird behavior in one of their mailboxes, and they realized that it was a forged credential, and that's partially why Microsoft got in trouble with the federal government and so on. So we're seeing, this is just to make the point that, setting aside, like obviously Microsoft, the types of leaked credentials and access tokens that we see in the wild is evolving quite a bit. It's not just like an API key that is accidentally in code. So lastly, I'm going to talk about sort of like brute forcing and harvesting. Again, none of this is new. We used to see in the past like login forms without any form of rate limiting and very simple credentials. But increasingly, what we're seeing now are malware that harvests credentials in various ways once they compromise a machine, and as well as supply chain attacks where, for instance, you have a malicious JavaScript library in NPM that is then actually used to mine credentials once it's deployed in a developer environment. So again, even on the brute forcing and harvesting side of things, they're not new techniques per se, but the way they have evolved has changed significantly throughout the years. And now that's how people get in. But then what happens once they are in is equally important and interesting. As we mentioned earlier, CrowdStrike is seeing a massive increase in the amount of like kerberoasting and in various forms of token forging to move laterally or escalate privileges. But also, we're starting to see interesting persistence and privilege escalation techniques also against cloud IDPs. So the MGM was breached a few years ago, and what the attackers did in that case was to basically try to install a malicious IDP in their environment so that they would maintain persistence to the environment. The other very common thing that we're starting to see are attackers registering malicious MFA factors or auth2 grants to maintain persistence in an environment in a way that is fairly stealthy, because while a lot of IDPs have audit logs, they often only are focused on sort of like the initial login ceremony. They don't really focus on what happens after that to access tokens and stuff. So just to give you a sense of some statistics, this is across the board. This is not just identity attacks. So again, the global threat report from CrowdStrike that was just released an hour ago showed that the average breakout time for a breach is 48 minutes. The median dwell time, so the number of days that an attacker stays undetected inside an environment, is about 10 days today. And most interestingly, over 50% of breaches are not actually detected by internal SOC teams. There's some kind of external notification where it's either the adversary itself, because they have like financial motive, so they're like a ransomware kind of gang or similar, or it's a third-party company that accidentally finds the breach. Now, just out of curiosity, we went through kind of like identity breaches to see how they perform compared to like your standard breach. And we see that in most cases, the dwell time for identity breaches is actually quite a lot longer than a dwell time for traditional breaches. Now, there is some noise in this data in the sense that some of these breaches are perpetrated by nation-state attackers, which are obviously stealthier in nature compared to like a e-crime gang. But we still see that dwell time tends to be longer. And then most importantly, the detection almost never happens at the identity layer. It almost always happens through some other means. So again, in the Storm 05 case, the State Department SOC detected a problem with their mailboxes. In the Change Healthcare case was ransomware. Cloudflare is the only case where actually you could argue that it was an identity detection, because what happened was the Cloudflare SOC team looked at Smartsheet audit logs, and they realized that somebody was elevating privileges in Smartsheet through a token that they had found. Mercedes-Benz was notified by an unaffiliated security vendor. The Cisco source code leak was leaked in a public forum. And Midnight Blizzard, it's Microsoft hasn't disclosed how they actually detected it. But we're seeing basically increased dwell time, detection that is almost never at the identity layer. And so what are the root causes of these breaches? Like, why are we seeing more identity breaches out there? And what can kind of like we learn from what we've seen so far? So there's one root cause that it's somewhat unrelated to identity, and it's the fact that compromising endpoints has become significantly harder today compared to what it used to be. But the other side of things is that identity is really kind of like the weak link in most cases. And I would posit that it's there's a variety of reasons, but I would say that three are clearly up there. One is access tokens are stateless, which means that once you have access to one, you have no logging capabilities, and so it's basically game time. So it's very interesting for an attacker to get access to access tokens. Two, a lot of authentication and authorization protocols have extremely complex implementations and corner cases. So a lot of like Kerberos attacks, Active Directory attacks, Auth2 attacks are against kind of like somewhat esoteric flows that are part of the protocol specs that are not particularly well user understood. And then lastly, permission models are not uniform across environments. So like every CSP has a different permission model. They're very complex to understand. Like if you look at the statistics on how many AWS environments are actually this privilege, the number is approximately 0, because the AWS IAM system is so complicated that it's impossible to right size permissions for a developer. And so that, and so the reason why sort of like permission systems are a problem is that they make privilege escalation effectively trivial. Once you have an initial foothold in an environment, it's very easy to move laterally and escalate privileges. Okay, so what can you do to defend against these attacks? So one is we've seen from public data and so on that identity attacks are not just about NHIs. You need to have coverage for both human and non-human identities. Two, as far like obviously posture management, lifecycle management, and PAM are all necessary, but clearly they're not enough. We're seeing people still getting breached. So we need to have detection and response capabilities on top of what we do from a governance perspective, which tends to be more compliance-based and prescriptive in nature. Audit logs from IDPs have improved a lot after the various Okta breaches. We now get a lot more information from IDPs. But again, they're somewhat incomplete in the sense that you see kind of like the initial login flow and you get a lot of audit logs out of that. But then after tokens are minted, you kind of like lose visibility. And so you need to know basically what happens to these tokens as they move around your different environments. We mentioned that MFA and FIDO2 are great in the sense that they're making sort of basic phishing harder to perpetrate, but they're definitely not enough. We're seeing a lot, as I mentioned, a lot of like esoteric flows that are being exploited. And then lastly, over permission and long-lived credentials are a big issue. And to the extent possible, migrating to just-in-time access would reduce the odds of easy privilege escalation and lateral movement once an attacker compromises the initial system. I want to leave you with a couple of predictions for the next couple of years. So one, as I mentioned, I think more and more phishing will go after somewhat esoteric auth 2 flows. We've seen there's a MDR company called Huntress, and they ran a study across their companies, and 10% of their companies were infected by some form of a malicious auth 2 app. So I think this is just going to get worse and worse. Attackers will continue scanning for new data sources and new ways to harvest credentials. Palo Alto, just maybe a year ago, showed that there was a mass campaign to scan for M files and credentials in M files. A researcher at DEF CON last year showed that you could do mass scanning of Docker images and a few other interesting resources to find credentials. And then, as I mentioned, state sponsor actors like Storm 558 are already using like crash dumps and Criterion crash dumps to harvest credentials. And then lastly, I think we're going to see a lot more stolen tokens leveraged for cloud breaches, not just on-prem breaches. Because for a couple of reasons. One, we're seeing harvesting tools harvest more and more tokens found in browsers and desktop applications. But also, most of what we know in terms of how people would move laterally in on-prem applies equally to cloud environments once you have the initial token. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I think I'm out of time. That's all I had. Thank you for being here. I'm around it. Okay, thank you. That